Looking back at Opel's history, it's easy to get the impression that this German brand has touched almost every segment, from small hatchbacks to SUVs and even sports cars. And against that background, it seems like Opel never really entered the premium class. But that's not entirely true. In the mid-1960s, Opel decided to step into the European premium segment, territory already dominated by Mercedes, BMW, and Jaguar. And it was quite a bold move. But let's take it step by step. Before the war, Opel already had six-cylinder models in its lineup, the Kapitan and the Admiral. They weren't premium cars in the strict sense, but they occupied the upper end of the mid-size segment. These were large, expensive vehicles out of reach for most people, bought instead by well-off customers, shop owners, small factory operators, and successful traders. The Admiral, which sat one step above the Kapitan, never saw strong demand. It was produced for just 2 years, from 1937 to 1939, with total production reaching around 6,000 units. The reason was fairly simple, and in many ways typical for Opel. The Admiral was too expensive for its intended audience, yet not prestigious enough for those who could afford more. It ended up stuck between two segments, without truly belonging to either. The Kapitan, on the other hand, was a different story. It aligned much more closely with what buyers actually wanted. Slightly smaller, more affordable, yet still carrying enough presence and status. Exactly as much as its audience expected. As a result, the model survived the war, went through 6 major updates, and became one of Opel's most successful cars of that era, with total production exceeding 400,000 units. The 6th-generation Kapitan, introduced in 1959, featured solid build quality, and in terms of size, it was already approaching the premium segment coming out of Stuttgart. On paper, this even placed it in the same league, but only on paper. In terms of status, Opel still fell short of Mercedes. The Kapitan held a strong position in the mid-size segment, competing with other solid, well-established rivals. But inside Opel, it was becoming clear, staying in that role was no longer enough. In the 1960s, the European premium segment was already spoken for. Jaguar, Maserati, and of course, Mercedes had firmly established themselves, with Mercedes as the clear and undisputed leader. A bit later, BMW joined the game, and from that point on, a rivalry began that continues to this day. And it was exactly this audience Opel decided to target. The problem was that Opel itself had no real experience building cars at that level. But General Motors, which owned Opel at the time, did. And GM was increasingly frustrated by how little presence it had in a market as large as Western Europe. The absence of compact models could be explained. They were struggling with that even at home. But the fact that American premium cars, which had only recently set the tone for the entire industry, were now almost absent in Europe, was something GM was not willing to accept. Especially since the trend was already reversing. German premium cars were beginning to enter the American market and compete there with domestic full-size models. That's why GM decided to act. On one hand, to regain ground in Europe. On the other, to stop the Europeans before they could fully establish themselves in the United States. And the timing was right. By that point, West Germany had largely recovered from the war. The economy was growing rapidly, and demand for expensive cars was increasing year by year. Opel entered the premium segment with 3 models at once, with development starting back in 1961. The entire lineup was named KAD, after the first letters of the models. The base model was the new generation Kapitan. In terms of design, it closely followed the American styling of the time. That was no coincidence. The project's design was led by American stylist Claire McKitchen, who was sent to Germany specifically to oversee it. The new Kapitan grew noticeably in size. By European standards, this was now a genuinely large car, nearly 25 centimeters longer than its predecessor, and even bigger than some competitors like Mercedes and Jaguar. The interior also took a clear step forward. In terms of materials and overall finish, it was now approaching Mercedes levels. Under the hood were proven inline-6 engines, 2.4 liters and around 100 horsepower. A manual transmission came as standard, with a 2-speed automatic available as an option. Equipment remained relatively restrained, but it's important to understand, The Kapitan was only the entry point. Above it sat the Admiral. Technically, it was very similar, but it offered more options, better sound insulation, and a more upscale interior. And at the top was the Diplomat, without any reservations. As standard, it came with a 4.6-liter Chevrolet V8, producing around 190 horsepower. It could reach 100 kilometers per hour in under 11 seconds and had a top speed of around 200 kilometers per hour. Very serious figures for its time. So while the Kapitan and Admiral were still balancing between the upper mid-size segment and premium, the Diplomat was already playing by the rules of a true luxury car. Powerglide automatic transmission, power windows, electrically adjustable seats, high-end materials, a vinyl roof, everything associated with premium cars of that era was there. The new KAD lineup debuted in 1964, and the reaction was very positive, both from the press and from buyers. The very idea that Opel would dare to challenge Mercedes had seemed almost unthinkable just a few years earlier. Sales started strong, and the Admiral quickly became the most popular model. For a relatively reasonable price, buyers were getting a large four-door sedan that came close to premium, while offering more features than competitors in the same price range. The Kapitan sold worse. Its position was unclear. In many ways, it ended up in the same spot as the pre-war Admiral. Too expensive for the mass buyer, yet not prestigious enough for wealthier customers. The Diplomat sold in even smaller numbers, but that was expected. This segment was never truly mass market, and Opel understood that well. At the same time, the Diplomat did have a distinct audience. These were what you could call rationally wealthy buyers, people who wanted a premium car with all the features, but without paying extra for the badge. And that's exactly what GM was counting on. A lower price was supposed to be the key argument in Opel's favor. But before the new models had even fully settled into the press, and before the first buyers had time to get used to them, Opel was already working on updates. And by 1965, the lineup received some serious upgrades. The Kapitan and Admiral were fitted with new 2.8-liter inline-six engines with an overhead camshaft. And for the first time, buyers could even order the same V8 that was used in the Diplomat. The Diplomat itself was also upgraded. It received a larger 5.4-liter Chevrolet engine, producing around 230 horsepower. That same year, the most unusual version appeared, the two-door Diplomat Coupe. And this was no longer a typical European car. In terms of luxury and overall feel, it was much closer to American land yachts, or the Grand Touring class. To this day, that coupe is considered the most equipped Opel ever built, and one of the most expensive when adjusted for inflation. But the market for it was just as narrow. A little over 300 units were produced in total, and today it remains one of the rarest and most valuable Opel models on the collector market. A new generation of the KAD lineup arrived in 1969. This time, the designers finally gave each model a more distinct identity. The Kapitan and Admiral remained visually close to each other, while the Diplomat received its own look, with vertical front headlights, making it much harder to confuse with the lower-tier Opel models. At the same time, the entire lineup became slightly smaller, but gained more powerful and more efficient engines. The updated KAD models were now marketed as purely European cars, with a clear effort to distance them from American styling. But the result was not very convincing. The Diplomat, even without badges, still looked more like a typical American car of the era than a European premium model. And instead of growing, sales began to decline. The Kapitan was hit the hardest. Demand dropped so much that it was discontinued as early as May 1970, just a year after its debut. The Admiral and Diplomat lasted longer, but their run also came to an end in 1977. The Senator, which replaced them, moved down a class, into the segment occupied by the BMW 5 Series and the Mercedes E-Class. The buyer's logic was simple. Why choose an Opel if, for a little more money, you could get a Mercedes? And that's exactly what people did. Mercedes sales were in the hundreds of thousands, while the Diplomat sold only around 61,000 units. A significant share of those went to corporate fleets and government agencies. Private buyers chose it far less often. Yes, the Diplomat did have its own audience, the so-called rationally wealthy, but there simply weren't enough of them to make a real difference. The problem also lay in GM's strategy itself. The formula of more car and more engine for less money could work in the United States, but in Europe it ran into the reality of brand perception. In theory, selling these cars not as Opel, but under Buick or Cadillac might have made sense. Those brands were not widely present in Europe, but they were still associated with large engines and prestige. But there was another limitation. American brands simply did not have a dealer network in Europe, while Opel already had a well-established one. In the end, GM and Opel tried to play in the premium segment, but the rules there were not theirs.